la Cátedra de Integración Germánico Salgado, con el apoyo del Área de Estudios Sociales y Globales y el KEI, les da la bienvenida a la primera conferencia del año de la serie Retos para América Latina. En esta ocasión tendremos como invitado al profesor Andrew Bennett. Moderará el profesor Pablo Andrade. Cedo la palabra al profesor Pablo Andrade.
Quiero darle la bienvenida a Andrew Bennett. Andrew Bennett es profesor de gobierno en la Universidad de Georgetown. Es uno de los más reconocidos expertos en Rusia y en la política de la antigua Unión Soviética. Andy es también uno de los co-creadores de uno de los más potentes métodos para el estudio de decisiones en relaciones internacionales y en general en ciencia política, conocido como Process Tracing, y es la segunda vez que lo tenemos como invitado en estas reuniones. El año pasado tuvimos una charla precisamente sobre el tema de Ucrania al mes, creo, de que inició la guerra en Ucrania. So welcome all of you, sorry. Professor, today we have as a guest Professor Andrew Bennett. Andy is a professor at Georgetown University and one of the most recognized experts on Russian politics and the former Soviet Union politics. He's also a creator of one of the most important methods for studying decision making in international relations and in general in social sciences, known as process tracing. So Andy, welcome once again, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Professor Andrade, and thank you for inviting me back again, and thanks to all those who are joining us today. I should start off my talk probably the same way I did the previous talk. I mean, I've just had a very kind introduction about my expertise, but I should say first that I did not expect that Putin was going to invade Ukraine a year ago. I like to think that he got it wrong, not that I got it wrong, but objectively, I was wrong in anticipating his behavior. So that reminds us that he can be a difficult to read person, and so we can't have too much confidence in our judgments, including my own. So here we see a map of where the forces of the Russians and the Ukrainians are. It has not changed in many months, but that does not mean that the war is going to stay stable. Both sides are getting ready for major offensives. If we remember a year ago, just to review the broad outlines of the war, a year ago, Russia tried to attack towards Kiev as well as in the east. Since then, the Ukrainians have pushed them away from Kiev and also retaken some territory in the east. So this is one person's review of the military balance. There's too much going on in this slide, but I provided just so you have the link if you want to go look to it yourself. And I'm going to pick out parts of this for the next several slides. So I'm going to review the military balance, and then I'm going to address 8 of the key questions about the next phases of the war. You probably read that recently, after much debate, the NATO alliance is giving more advanced tanks to the Ukrainian forces. 112 Leopards, 31 Abrams tanks from the United States. Also, perhaps even more important, are many armored transport vehicles, which will give the Ukrainians more mobility. So it will be a challenge for Ukraine to maintain so many different vehicles, and it will take months for them to be trained and to get them fully operational in the field. There will not be any one type of weapon that will be the the magic weapon to end this war. But the general trend is that Ukraine has gotten stronger, has as much equipment or more equipment than when they started the war, and the Russians have less. To be clear, the Russians have more equipment than the Ukrainians, but the Russians have less than they started the war with. So the main Russian advantage right now is in aircraft. The Ukrainians have kept some of their planes flying, which is amazing by itself, and they're improving their air defenses with new systems from the United States. But Russia still has combat superiority in the air. Russia has been very cautious to use its fighter aircraft. One, because they want to keep some in reserve in case NATO were to get involved. And two, they're very expensive to lose. So they're being more cautious. At the start of the war, they now learned a little bit more of how to avoid the Ukrainian air defenses. So again, the general picture is Ukraine has about as many aircraft operational as when it started the war, and the Russians have fewer than they started the war. Remember, a key factor here is NATO and the United States have been resupplying Ukraine, and we have many times the gross national product of Russia. Also, Russia is having difficulty making new armaments because of the trade sanctions keeping out critical components. Okay, and the Ukrainians have been very clever about making simple new weapons like handmade bombs to drop from drones. So here we see the troop numbers. Russia's the brown line, and initially they dropped down, and then now they brought in many more conscripts, people forced to join the military, and their numbers are coming back up. And the Ukrainians' numbers have been going up throughout. There have been huge casualties on both sides. Russia has lost an estimated 200,000 soldiers killed or wounded. That's about 10 times as much as they lost in 10 years in Afghanistan. And remember that the loss of just 15,000 soldiers in Afghanistan was one of the political developments that ended the Soviet Union. Russia has about 3 times as the population of Ukraine, but the Ukrainians are more strongly motivated. But the Ukrainians have also lost probably over 100,000 soldiers and many civilians as well, including some of their best trained soldiers. Ukrainian soldiers have been training in Britain and in other NATO countries to prepare to go back to the front. So artillery is an important part of this war. We see that the Russians, again, have been declining in the numbers of systems they have, and the Ukrainians have stayed about level or actually increased in terms of armored vehicles. Okay, so here are 8 key issues I want to talk about. Maybe you can just translate each one, and then I'll talk about each one in the following slides. I see people are putting questions in the chat line. Please keep doing that, and at the end, we'll come back to the questions all together. So Russia sometimes has threatened that it will try to come back at Kiev again through Belarus, which has been one of the few allies Russia has left. I think that's unlikely, but just the possibility forces Ukraine to keep some forces ready to defend Ukraine. The Belarusian government has been reluctant to support the war too strongly because it faces domestic opposition. So Ukraine also is preparing for possible offensives. The most likely would be to try to go through the middle of Russian forces toward the coast of the Black Sea around the city of Melitopol, and that would break the land bridge between the Russian forces in the east and Russia in Crimea. The Ukrainians could also attack into the Donbass in the north, where most of the fighting is happening right now. Crimea is the most important region politically for Putin. Currently, the Ukrainian forces don't have missiles with a range to reach Crimea, but if they take more territory and move up, they could do that. I would say for most of the war, a lot of experts in the United States felt that it would be not possible or not a good idea for Ukraine to try to take back Crimea. Crimea is the only part of Ukraine that when Ukraine had a vote, a referendum on its relations with Russia, Crimea was the only part that was about 50-50. After that vote, the Russians moved into Crimea, and so many Ukrainians have left. This is one reason that a lot of experts felt it would be dangerous for Ukraine to try to take back Crimea, and also very difficult militarily. But I would say, I think in the last few months, the discussion in Washington and in NATO has changed, and there's a little bit more openness to the idea that the Ukrainians might try to take back Crimea. The feeling is this would create very strong pressure on Putin and might even push him out of power because Crimea is so sensitive politically in Russia. But this also means that an attack on Crimea might make Putin desperate, and he might escalate, perhaps even using a nuclear weapon. I'll say more about the nuclear issue in a minute, but I just want to say this is still somewhat controversial in Washington, the Crimea issue, and last week some defense officials testified that it would be very hard for the Ukrainians to take back Crimea for at least a year. So another key question is whether Russian soldiers will revolt. They've had very low morale through the war, and I think it's gotten even worse. We have a lot of evidence of at least isolated uprisings by soldiers. They're arguing with their commander officers, and they're more and more aware that they're being used as sort of human cannon fodder. Just their lives are not being treated as valuable by the Russian government. So it's hard to predict a revolt in a military organization. Usually what happens is what we call a cascade. It starts small and then it can quickly grow as other people join the revolt. We saw this happen with the quick collapse of the Afghan government after the United States pulled its forces out. Also, Russian soldiers continue to fear that they will be killed by their own army if they protest or try to leave. So it's hard to predict if a revolt might happen, but this is something that experts are paying close attention to. It's also hard to predict if elites in Russia might try to push Putin out of power. There are some signs of disagreements between the regular military and the not regular military headed by the Wagner group, headed by Prigozhin. So the oligarchs are not happy about the war. It's hurting their bank accounts, but they keep dying in strange ways, and they don't have an ability to work with others in the military to try to change the regime. Also, Putin has tried to preempt or prevent any coup by dividing the Russian internal security forces into different organizations. So I think it's unlikely that elites will try to remove Putin anytime soon, but if he uses a nuclear weapon, there might be strong pressure on them to do that.
Por lo tanto, no se puede prever realmente de que pueda haber un movimiento de las élites o del público, de la gente, en perspectiva de derrocar a Putin. Sin embargo, el uso de armas nucleares podría ser el detonante de que esas condiciones se produzcan.
But even if Putin is removed from power, or even if he dies from natural causes, the government that follows might be just as aggressive in the war, maybe even more aggressive. I also think it's not likely there will be a public demonstration or revolt that pushes Putin from power. Putin has already arrested over 10,000 dissidents. So another question is whether NATO will escalate by giving more aircraft and long-range missiles to Ukraine. The HIMARS rocket launcher that the U.S. has given to Ukraine can send missiles to different ranges. We've only allowed them missiles that go 50 miles. We have not given them missiles that go 185 miles, which they have asked for many times. The long-range missile, the ATACMS missile, can go 185 miles, and that could reach Crimea from the current lines between Russia and Ukrainians. But the U.S. has so far refused to give those missiles and also refused to give F-16 fighter aircraft. Of course, the U.S. also refused for many months to give tanks, and now we're doing that. So some people think that, events are moving towards sharing some of these weapons. The long-range ATACMS missile could go into service very quickly because the Ukrainians are already using the HIMARS system. The F-16 would take many months to train. The British are already training some Ukrainian pilots for the British Typhoon, another type of aircraft. So this shows the range of the current missiles, which are the smaller circles. The long-range missile could go all the way to the green circle and cover all of Crimea. So another question is whether Putin will use a nuclear weapon. The most likely possibility is he would use a tactical nuclear weapon, a small nuclear weapon on the battlefield. So most experts think he will not use a nuclear weapon because it doesn't have much military advantage. The non-nuclear weapons are already almost the same explosive power as the small nuclear weapons. And several times Putin has talked about nuclear weapons, but so far there's been no sign that their forces are preparing to use them. But we cannot be too confident that Putin will not escalate or even using a nuclear weapon. I think there are several things that could lead to that. Attacks on Crimea, attacks into Russian territory, those could lead to nuclear escalation, or possibly also the provision of fighter aircraft. There have been already some small attacks on Russian territory by the Ukrainians, but the U.S. has warned them not to be aggressive with Russian territory. So if Putin were to use a nuclear weapon, NATO has many options. I won't read all of these. This is a list from former NATO commander, Admiral Stavridis. But basically, we could use non-nuclear forces in many ways to retaliate if Russia uses nuclear weapons. Also, if Putin uses a nuclear weapon, he will lose some support in China and India, two of the few big countries that have not entirely condemned his actions in Ukraine. So another question is, who has time on their side? Who is in a better position the longer the war goes on? And of all these issues here, this is one on which I think the experts are the most divided. Some have written analyses that Ukraine has time on their side. Some say that the longer the war goes, the stronger Russia will become. And this uncertainty is one of the reasons the war is continuing. Both sides think that they can win in the end. Putin hopes that the NATO alliance will break up over this. And NATO hopes that Russia will run out of supplies or face a revolt by its soldiers. I don't think either one of those will happen for several months at least. But after the next rounds of offensive by both sides, we could be in a different situation in a few months from now. The Republican Party, which has taken back the House in the United States Congress, is starting to become more divided on aid to Ukraine, but still many Republicans and Democrats support continued aid to Ukraine. My view is that Ukraine has time on its side because of assistance from the West. We saw that Russia is losing forces in Ukraine as steady or even increasing its capability. Also, the morale among Ukrainian forces is much higher. Morale leads to success. Success leads to aid from the West. Aid from the West leads to more success. So another question is whether negotiations might happen. In negotiations theory, there has to be a hurting stalemate. Both sides are hurting every day, and they don't see an advantage. They don't see a possibility to improve on the battlefield. So even though the war looks like a stalemate, it hasn't moved much. Both sides are hurting. They still think that they could win the war militarily. And there's no country or group of countries that has enough power to push concessions on both sides. So one final question is how might the war end? And it's pretty clear what the possibilities are. a victory by Ukraine, a victory by Russia, or negotiated outcome. For all the reasons I've given, you can see that none of those are likely to happen in the next few months. But I think this equilibrium is going to be hard to sustain more than several months, and we could be in a different position. After each side has tried its offensives, we'll see which side is able to achieve any success. Okay, let me stop there. Thank you for the questions in the chat line. Maybe you can read some of those questions for me.
Okay, I'm going to read some of the questions, but I have to read them. I have a question from Lydia. She asks, for how much time you think Ukraine and its allies will have resources to contain the Russian offensive?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, that question.
Yeah, good question. So the United States and NATO have been using up a lot of our ammunition in particular. We have a lot of other equipment, tanks, aircraft that we've not yet given to Ukraine, but ammunition is the key challenge right now. At the start of the war, there was a lot of old Soviet equipment in the different parts of the Warsaw Pact that went to Ukraine, which was still using many Soviet weapons. Now Ukraine is becoming more dependent on newer Western NATO weapons and the ammunition, and that creates logistical challenges. People say that amateurs talk about strategy and experts talk about logistics. So behind the newspapers, it doesn't get much attention, but there's a massive logistical effort to keep supplying all these very different weapon systems. And the U.S. is increasing its production of ammunition, but this will continue to be a challenge. But I think the Russians have a bigger challenge than we do because of their smaller resources and because of sanctions.
According to the news, tomorrow, I don't understand, Ukraine is going to enter to the European Union. What implications would this have in order to for the war?
So one of the first things that the Europeans did when Putin invaded was to start pushing and accelerating the process of bringing Ukraine into the European Union. So like so many other things, Putin has created the very thing that he feared. Now, I don't think them officially joining the EU will have much effect on actual, economic and military goods going across borders, because that has already been happening and accelerated. But it has a political significance because it shows that Europe is, it's another way they're committed to the long-term success of Ukraine, and it's going to be, hurt Putin politically in Russia.
What is the role that China is playing in this conflict?
Yes, another great question. So if you remember, Xi Jinping met with Putin just a few weeks before Putin invaded. And of course, we don't know exactly what they said or promised to each other, but we do know that whatever Xi Jinping said, it did not prevent Putin from invading 2 weeks later. And we do know that after the war started, when they met again and they had a communique from that meeting, it did not mention Ukraine by name, but it mentioned Taiwan by name. So that shows that China is now clearly the dominant partner there and is getting what it wants. But at the same time, China, I think, is not happy that the Russians have not succeeded in Ukraine. And they're not happy that this has brought together the NATO alliance in a way that it could bring together allies if China were to attack Taiwan. At the same time, China and also India are very happy to buy oil from Russia at lower prices. But I do think, I hope at least, that if Putin were to use a nuclear weapon, that would be too much for China and India. They would have to be public in their criticism.
No?
I don't see
That's all.
any other questions.
Mhm.
Which I think it works because it has been already an hour, and so I think that I'm going to wrap up the meeting by thanking Andy for his presentation. By implication, and if I'm following your analysis right, Andy, we will have another chance to talk. So anyway,
I'm afraid that's right. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible war that's going on there, and it's not going to end soon, I think.
Yeah. Well, anyway, thank you all. Thank you, the audience, and see you soon. Well,
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.